Thanks very much, Ian, and really delighted to have the opportunity to join you all today and also to get to be on a panel with Sue Bennett and hear your questions later. As Ian mentioned, I join you from both a futures unit based in New South Wales, but also a national team that's been focused on how do we bring together data from across governments in Australia to improve outcomes for people with disability. And today I'll mention a few instances where that could improve outcomes for children with disability. I'm going to focus first on the digital life of the child from the perspective of the work currently underway in governments to improve the data that would be available for those first 9 years of this child's life, looking out to 2030. I'm then going to turn to the life of the child as they become a young adult and an adult, looking out to 2050, and the different efforts that will need to be made to respond to the expectations that governments are hearing from communities about the information available to them and the role that they play in data. So for the first 9 years of the child's life, lucky enough to be born into Australia today, the focus for governments is going to be on making sure that data is collected and then used in a way that connects the child and their family to supports that they need to thrive. And I guess there are so many potential ways that data and digital could be used. I thought it would be helpful to break it down into 3 key information needs that we tend to work towards in government. The first is that data is made available to those working directly with children and to parents, families, caregivers, in order that they can more accurately assess a child's needs. So early on, that might be information available to, say, nurses and parents to help assess a child's development and whether they're hitting milestones, and then perhaps later to an early educator or a teacher in kindergarten and year 1 to see how they're progressing at preschool and school. And I think anyone who's had a child in the last 10 years born into their family would note just how extensive the information is about the milestones and the micro milestones that each child can be expected to reach. The second information need, I think, is really about data that's available to the system responsible for providing services and supports to a child and to their families, so that they can see whether there's a match between those needs and the services available. And this isn't just questions about, is a service available in the area that a child and their family live? It's much more nuanced questions about whether that service is appropriate to that child's needs. So if a child has a disability, for example, particular type of disability like autism, is there a service available that's inclusive and specialist to the particular needs of that child? There's also a need on the part of our systems to understand how children and families are making their way through different service systems, so what we often refer to as pathways analysis. And the third information need is making data available to those analysing and researching the evidence base about how to best meet the needs of a child and their family. So this is about connecting needs, services and supports and the funding attached to those to the outcomes that a child can achieve and that cohorts of children can achieve. So I think reflecting on where we are today in 2021, the child born today will benefit from a much better understanding that we've got globally over recent decades about the power of early intervention to change the pathway that children are on, regardless of where they start from. And this is not just about government services, I hasten to add, although I mostly think about data in those terms. It's really crucially also what are called in disability informal supports, so the supports that come from family and community, or the supports that a family might privately pay for, as well as the value for a child of being born into an inclusive community or a democracy, things that are more intangible but really important to life outcomes. Even though we have learnt a great deal about early intervention over recent decades, I think governments come from the perspective, as do most researchers in the sector, that there is so much more to learn, and particularly where children have specific needs. So, for example, a child born with a particular developmental delay in a culturally diverse family, what are the particular needs that they would have? So a child born into Australia in 2021 will to some extent have their experience and their life trajectory shaped by the data and information systems that underpin those services and supports available to them and to those working directly with them and their parents. And in particular today, I'm focusing on those really rich insights that can come from linking data from service systems and from survey data in a way that isn't about identifying any individual child. It's subject to privacy preserving and de-identification techniques, but is about understanding the particularities of how children and different cohorts of children move through pathways in life. There are, of course, though, also data systems that are about identifying particular children and families, and they're really important to things like child protection outcomes. So if we step back and say, where are we in 2021 in Australia? There's lots of work that's been underway over the past 5 to 10 years in particular by Australian governments to really improve those data systems that support the needs I talked about. And if this child is born in about half of Australia's states or territories, they are likely to be born into a jurisdiction that has the kind of data linkage that I was talking about to some extent. But overall, it will be patchy. In the other half, they might not have access to, or the service systems that are serving them will not have access to those. And nowhere is there really high quality nationally linked data. And that's where it is important to acknowledge in today's discussion that Australia is comparatively behind in the way that governments have access to data systems to inform their own services and have provided access to others, such as researchers or those that provide services, as well as individuals in the society. And we're behind comparable countries like New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Canada, basically because we have an unusual federal split of who funds different services. And so not only are we a federation with all the coordination challenges of that, but we're a federation where key services provided to children and families are provided across different levels of government. So even if you think about the next month of this child's life, they're likely to be born into a hospital system, perhaps one provided by a state government, but then very quickly when they go home, they'll be serviced by community nurses, also probably provided by a state government, but potentially if born into an Aboriginal community, perhaps by an Aboriginal service provider, medical provider. They will then go to a GP who will be...
Thank you, Frances. We were really getting into the final stages of that discussion about child born today. One of the important points that Frances has raised, and part of what she does, is the work to bring the data sets together to better understand that life of a child born and living and engaging in the both the National Disability Insurance Scheme and more broadly. Frances, we lost you for a moment there, which again shows the importance of our dependence on technology. Is it possible to get just some wrap-up statements, and then we'll hand across to Sue?
Absolutely. So my two wrap-up statements are that fortunately for the child born today, they are born into a country that is massively accelerating their efforts to provide the kind of data systems that I've spoken about today. But I wanted to look forward to when they are in their teenage years and then as young adults and point out two expectations that we're hearing from communities. One is that these information systems are not just for governments, they are also for people who are making decisions about their own lives. And it's not just a one-way transfer of data that governments hold, but it's also about a rich conversation about the information that communities have about their own outcomes and what's important to them. And the second is a demand to have a voice in how the data is being used. And we really see this particularly in the Closing the Gap agreement recently signed by governments, where there's a commitment to sharing much more data, but also a commitment to sharing the decision-making about data. So I look forward to hearing from Sue and then hearing from your questions.
Thanks very much, Frances. And so our next speaker on this topic is Sue Bennett, and as mentioned, Sue is Professor and Deputy Director and Connected Child Co-Leader at the ARC Centre for Excellence for the Digital Child. Sue, without further ado, over to you.
Thanks, Ian, and thank you, Francis, for getting us started with this session. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. By way of introduction, I'm going to start a story, the story of a child born today and what they're likely to experience as they grow up surrounded by technology. It's clear to all of us that a baby born today is born into an increasingly digital world. For many decades, new innovations in digital technologies have been changing the ways we live our lives, from the ways we work and learn to the ways we communicate, the ways we socialise, the ways we interact with government services such as education and health, and the ways we spend our leisure time. We were well aware of this before COVID, but perhaps we're even more aware of it now. Given that technology has enabled many of us to learn and work safely from home, maintain contact with our families, friends and communities, order essentials and other things online, all while we're being restricted from our usual in-person activities. Through information provision across the internet, contact tracing apps, we've been able to manage some of the risks of the pandemic, and health professionals who've been able to provide care remotely have done so through the help of technology. And although we've seen some of the downsides, such as spread of misinformation, technology has been vital in helping us get through this so far. So what now from this point in our history for the 800 or so babies that will be born today in Australia? Well, although we might say those babies are just coming into the world now, in fact, most of them already have a digital footprint. And that footprint will have started in a number of ways. So the most familiar one is an ultrasound photo shared through social media, together with accompanying comments from family and friends. Perhaps parents used a pregnancy app to track progress in anticipation of today. And even before that, parents might have used a fertility app to help them conceive. Each interaction on social media or with an app produces data. Some of that data is information that we've entered ourselves, numbers, words, images, and some of that data is automatically generated, say from settings such as locations and timestamps. All of this data can be analysed and used in real time or cumulatively over time, and it can also be bundled together in new and unexpected ways. This data can be used to provide information, deliver targeted advertising, or make recommendations to individuals. And it can be used to build profiles that power the algorithms and models that we've been talking about earlier. And it can be sold on to third parties. And all of this before day one in the lives of babies born today. So what might we expect through the next 5, 10, 15 years and beyond? There will, of course, be much more sharing of photos and videos, real-time calls online to stay in touch. As young children grow and explore the world, touchscreen technologies become increasingly part of their lives. They'll be playing games and consuming and creating content through smartphones and tablets. As homes become smart homes, households are purchasing voice-activated smart devices that respond to our requests. A great recent example you might have seen in the media was of a family who discovered their young child had been having conversations with their smart speaker. Add to this internet-enabled toys, including, say, internet-connected teddy bears that can play back sounds recorded on a smartphone, figurines with motion sensors and face recognition that become part of gameplay, and programmable robots from the simple to the sophisticated. And now as we move our attention beyond the home, early childhood education and care services are using technology to connect children, families, carers, educators and other professionals supporting children. These are online platforms allowing communication and sharing of information. Health services and health records are becoming increasingly digitised in a similar way, with clinics and services collecting, storing and sharing information from the earliest stages of a child's life. And as a child grows older, this continued recording, generating, storing and sharing of data occurs across schooling, through the official platforms for learning and records of assessment, through homework and educational apps. It expands through health monitoring apps like wearable devices that monitor physical activity and nutrition and manage medical conditions. And over time, with growing independence, the babies born today will be making their own choices about engaging with technologies that we know about now and whatever technologies come next. I'll stop here with the description because I'm sure we'll all have a picture in our minds about the lives ahead for these babies. And I'll leave us to ponder some of the big questions. How can we make the most of the power of technology and the data generated to make our lives better? How can we head off some of the perils that we're already alert to and be ready to face new ones? How can we balance protections, especially for the most vulnerable in our society, with personal choice and freedoms? Thank you for listening, and back to you, Ian.
Great. Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sue. Now, we have a first audience question which has come in, and it's challenging for us to get away from the topic of data, because data, of course, is how we're understanding the world around us, but also something we're increasingly generating as we use online services. And Sue, you raised some really interesting points about an internet-enabled teddy bear, which I have to say is slightly mind-blowing. The question really is, how might we effectively coordinate and scale co-design of our digital technologies? And the thinking behind that question is that if we are constantly keeping people-centered design, people-focused outcomes at the heart of everything we do, that should be a defense against or protection against doing the wrong thing, inadvertently doing things which are not for the net benefit of people in the long term. But scaling that people-centered design is challenging. Sue, I might ask you first, how would we effectively go about coordinating and scaling co-design for digital technologies?
Well, I think starting is a good place, because actually I would say that we do very little co-design of technology with the people who will end up using it. And if we're talking about children, sometimes people, I think, have a deficit view and think children don't really know what's good for them. They don't know what they need. They don't really know what they want. So a lot of the products that are created for children are created by people who've actually not even worked with the children, often produce something that has then been tested on children and don't have an iterative cycle then of using that feedback to improve technologies as well. And, you know, what we know about technologies is as we domesticate them, we often actually change the way that the designers ever envisaged that we would use them. So I think we have to fundamentally change our mindset and build it into the model of interaction. With that will come a cost. It'll come a cost in time and additional work. But it's overdue, absolutely.
I love the expression of domesticating technologies. I think that's wonderful. Francis, there are more questions coming in, so I'm going to offer you the choice of either talking about the co-design or talking about the importance of language, and the language and the semantics that we use really matters. I know it's a little bit unfair. The question that's just come in is language and semantics matters, that they carry stories of power and how it's distributed. How might framing things like smart cities to smart citizens or netizens change how we place ourselves in that picture? Actually, it's probably best that I ask you that question.
Maybe I'll try to answer both, Ian, because as it happens, I really agree with Sue that and I'll talk on behalf of governments, any government data and digital initiatives need to start with co-designing what it is that we're trying to produce in terms of what we'd call insight tools. And why I start there is to say in the National Disability Data Asset Pilot, we did that when we started working, even though we didn't yet have all of the data back end to power those tools. And what we really heard from people with disability that we co-designed with, although I'll hasten to add they were not children and young people, so I would agree with Sue, there is a need to expand to hearing from those voices, is that it is about how you tell the story. So people were very clear that they didn't just want a bunch of data insights about them put online for others to read, that what they wanted to see was the data insights that can be generated by the kinds of data that government holds, but then the stories that speak to the power of the lived experience of people with disability and saying, do those data insights resonate in my life or do they not? And what's the missing part of our picture? And so I think this goes to the fact that I think increasingly communities are saying it's not just about data, it's about information, knowledge and stories, and really bridging that kind of quite antiquated idea that you have quantitative insights and you have qualitative insights. No, you have insights that are developed through a much more sophisticated dialogue between those. And that can be really effectively done through co-designing the technology whereby we share those insights.
Great, fantastic. Now, I asked Hugh and Kathy questions about data, and my question went along the lines of, when will we reach the point that we actually know and understand how to appropriately use data, acknowledging biases, acknowledging potential harms, acknowledging all of the challenges? Hugh gave a very strong answer around bias and the skills that statisticians develop around bias. But really, I'm talking more generally around data, and Sue raised the point about, again, internet-connected teddy bears, where there are data sets being generated and interactions being analysed, which we wouldn't otherwise have expected. So, Frances, I'll stay with you first. Where do you think we are in terms of our ability to handle data appropriately? And then, Sue, I'm going to ask you a similar question, but take the bent on a question around appropriateness of use. But Frances, I'll start with you. Where do you think, when will we get to the point where we actually know how to use data safely?
Oh, that is a tricky one. I'm going to say I think we use data very safely within governments where we've had a lot of experience with that particular data. So that might be data within a particular service system. We've been using it for decades. We're very aware of the limitations of that data. But what we're talking about, and I think what Hugh and Kathy were talking about, is much more sophisticated linked and integrated data sets, and also much more sophisticated methodologies to use that data. And we should be very open in saying we're relatively early on in that process. And that's not just about understanding the data itself, it's also about that process of triangulation I referred to, of saying, even once you understand the data very well, that's only ever part of the picture. What are your other sources of insights? So I think I would say that governments have heard those expectations from communities, and we are busily figuring out what are the systems that need to be in place to really systematically learn the power and the limits of data and the insights that we should be developing.
Thanks, Frances. Thanks, Frances. And so, Susan, the parallel questions of appropriate use. It may seem innocuous to have a teddy bear connected to the internet, but there are some real challenges there. And as we increasingly can do things, how do we reframe the conversation around what we should be doing? How do we tell appropriate use?
I think one of the things that we need to be able to do is to have much greater transparency around the data collected and how it's used. You know, for most of us, we're aware that data is being collected about us and it's being used in particular ways, but it's actually invisible to us. It's hidden, it's obscured, and that's deliberate because data is a valuable commodity. It's commercializable, but that value is lost to us because we're engaged in relationships where we're required or we're expected to give it away in exchange for another kind of service. So I think until we can actually have a level of ownership over our data, even as we've given it away, and have some control and some say in how it's used, this goes really back to Frances's point. I think about, how do we, inherent in providing people with a data-driven service is actually understanding both what they want and allowing them to bring their interpretations to say, actually, you've got this bit wrong, or no, I don't want you to use this, and I don't want you to use these things together. So it strikes me that in so much of our lives, we're giving away for free something that's incredibly valuable to us. And if we can put some of the control back, and also I think build in some social norms to how we expect, not just government, but also commercial providers to engage with our data in responsible ways. And these are moral and ethical questions for us to engage in, and dialogues that we really need to have as a society.
Thanks very much. And Frances, going to go back to you and ask you about that moral and ethical dialogue. Is there a way that we can fast forward and build those frameworks so that we actually have something that we can use as our touchstone for appropriate for use of data?
So the thinking done on this, both through the disability project I mentioned, but also I think we owe a great deal to the thinking that Aboriginal communities have done and then brought into the discussion about closing the gap, is that dialogue is about institutionalising that dialogue. So I'd slightly reframe it, Ian, and say we should absolutely have frameworks, but what matters to everyone is that those frameworks are used every day, and that the dialogue understands how they're being used, can challenge use, and can evolve the uses over time in a way that has community trust and social license. So I think we are early on in this understanding, but I think that the Closing the Gap National Agreement that was signed this year by governments is very interesting in that it agrees to shared decision-making about the use of data, where there is that institutionalised dialogue between a given community or an organisation and government around the use of data. I should say the role of individuals in that is much more difficult because the way that data systems are configured, it is not a matter of just saying, I'd like to opt out. So I think that's a kind of almost a separate problem set. But I do think that that idea of institutionalising dialogue about acceptable data uses is where participatory data stewardship thinking or data sovereignty thinking is developing by communities and in dialogue with governments.
Great, thank you very much, Frances. We've got 2 minutes left, so I just want to ask you one question. Really, I want you to dig deep and think about 2050. What are the most important topics that we're discussing in 2050 about the life of this child?
Well, I think there's one word, which is inequalities. We have seen, despite all of the advances that we've made, although some inequalities fade away, some persist, new ones arise, and they continue. So I think that, we need to look at how those inequalities are arising, and we need to have our eyes very much on inclusion.
Thank you very much. Frances, 2050, what's the most important topic we're discussing?
How are we empowering the 31-year-old child, now a young adult or a mature adult, to not only engage in making decisions about their own lives, but to engage in their communities and as a citizen about the issues that matter to them?
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Frances and Sue, thank you very much for walking us through the life of the child. And we're going to take a short break now. We're taking a 10-minute break for morning tea. We're back at 10:40 Australian Eastern Standard Time, where we'll pick up with avoiding a digital dark age. So 10-minute break. Thank you all very much.